Well, we are recording, so welcome to FinTech Australia's podcast on the future of account-to-account payments in Australia. And I'm here, my name is Sinead Lynch. I'm a technology and data partner at Gadens Lawyers, advising in payments and technology and data and all things related. And I am delighted to be joined today by Tom Rundle, who is the Chief Product Officer at Azupay. And Tom will introduce himself shortly and give some little background on Azupay and your role in this environment. And also Michael Manassian, who is the Vice President Business Development APAC at Nium. Guys, really great to have you here. Thank you for being here. I'm really excited actually about this particular podcast because I think this is a really great one to wrap up the future of account-to-account payments in Australia, the role that fintech providers like you play in this, and how we are going to move forward from a future-focused perspective in relation to transitioning off legacy account-to-account payment systems to a more modernised framework. So first of all, before we jump into, and we've got a list of things that we do want to talk about on this podcast, but before we jump into that, can I turn to you, Tom, first of all, to give a little bit of an introduction on you and on Azupay and your initial kind of role in the future of account-to-account?
Sure. Yeah, great. Thanks for having me on this podcast. So I'm the Chief Product Officer at Azupay. I've been with Azupay about 4.5 years. Azupay is focused on commercialising the benefits of real-time account-to-account payments for businesses across Australia. Prior to that, I've had about 15 years now in scaling up payments-related fintechs.
Fantastic. Michael, love to hear from you as well in terms of your experience in this marketplace.
Right. Michael Manassian, I'm a VP for Business Development for the APAC region at Nium. Nium is a cross-border payments platform that acts as like an infrastructure layer for PSPs, banks, marketplaces, remittance companies to access our global network of payouts, pay-ins, and also we're a very large card issuer for both Visa and MasterCard. So we cover a very broad spectrum of payment related activities, and I'm really excited about talking about the future of account-to-account payments here in Australia. We bring a very international lens on it, but we're headquartered in Singapore, but a little known fact about Nium is that despite being a very large global organisation headquartered in Singapore and San Francisco, our first market to go live was actually Australia back in 2015. So it's one of our most mature markets we've operated in, and a market where we've learned a lot of lessons and we've seen a lot of growth. So yeah, happy to participate in today's discussion. Hopefully with industry peers such as yourselves, I can add some value, but looking forward to a great discussion.
Fantastic. And thanks so much for that, Michael. It's a great introduction into what we really do want to talk about, which is the current state of account-to-account payments here in Australia. And I think that international lens is really important to give your view as to what you see that current state looking at. And when we look at account-to-account, just for our listeners, we're talking about, where that sits across the NPP in terms of new payments platforms, Payee, Payee, and the real-time settlement, real-time payment settlement, and that transition away from BECS as the legacy A2A rails, but also thinking about open banking and CDR as well as that potential. So when we look at the system, the broader sort of infrastructure system within Australia, that system is rapidly evolving. There's a lot of regulatory reform, and us lawyers are, very much engaged in this space. But it's also increasingly part of critical national infrastructure within Australia. So it's obviously vital and important to the Australian economy. So when you take all of that into account, and maybe I'll turn to you, Michael, first, but I'm really keen to get your thoughts, Tom, as well. How do you think, and how would you describe where we are from a progression perspective, I guess, within Australia at the current time?
Look, I think Australia's status, I think, is the MPP is truly a world-class piece of infrastructure and system that's been built, and a lot of global payment, systems and ecosystems really look up to Australia with, and for a lot of learnings, etc. But so certainly, I think it is a world-class system that's been built. From our perspective, whilst it's a world-class, system, I feel that there's a way to go in terms of access. Access to it isn't as probably where it needs to be, and I can unpack that further. But certainly, I mean, when we look at, we operate in a variety of different, jurisdictions. we're direct participants in many of those jurisdictions. To answer your question, I think the MPP and what's been built here is certainly a cut above most other sort of domestic payment systems.
Tom, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, and can end up mirroring that very much to start with. Recognising that what Australia's got in real-time account-to-account payments is really world-class and real-world leading. There's a lot of, you mentioned there's a lot of change going on across the industry at the moment, and I think a lot of angst throughout the different parties. And it's very easy to fall in the trap of just looking at all the problems we're really trying to solve and getting really hung up on right now, and taking a moment to reflect and look at what it means to actually operate in a similar way in other countries can be really hard. And when you compare to other countries, it is really a useful exercise to do. And when I said I was in Scale Up before, it's been cross-border payments. So I've worked in domestic payments in 18 different countries in the past. And we often have this perception that across Southeast Asia, there's these amazing real-time wallets for payments. But sometimes when you look at it and what we've got in place going on in Australia in terms of just having this incredible vision that was pulled together for NPP, and this was the entire country, every single account, every single person can just send money to somebody else's mobile phone number, and it's the same experience on those pieces, and it happens instantly with final settlement. That's a really rare thing to have around the world, and it's incredibly valuable. But coming with that, with this vision of how big NPP was going to be, including the vision for Payee, coinciding at the same time as CDR, open banking around the world, and a different frameworks that ended up landing in Australia. We're getting really caught up at the moment around how we manage all those pieces. But I think we're doing a great job, and we've got some really great artifacts we should be proud of in this country.
And it's a great statement you've made. And I think when we sort of looked at that interoperability or the sort of cross-border interoperability issues that we do, and I talk about in a couple of moments. But I think when you look at what's happening around the world, if I look at the EU, you might say it's more mature because they've had PSD2 for a long time now, PSD3. But it's very regimented and very, prescriptive in terms of their approach to payments regulation more broadly. The US, obviously, a much more sort of network fragmented, rail specific, whereas here in Australia, we're sort of moving to that in between. Would you agree? Do you think that that's the better access in terms of being able to make it more accessible to industries within Australia? Do you think that's the better regime?
Look, when you say which one's better, you've got to recognise the different situations, the different ecosystems you're in. So particularly, I've had a lot of my time loving to beat up what's going on in the US and how fragmented it can be, and you've got networks of networks. But remember, California is a bigger economy than Australia, as is New York. And so, when we start talking about, hey, I want fintechs to get closer to the infrastructure layer and the access layer, keep in mind what the commercials of that mean, when that would be like a fintech trying to say, I want to build up the infrastructure for California, and somebody else saying, I want to build up the infrastructure for New York. And to some extent, some of that's happened. And hence you end up with that fragmented arrangements in the US. And we're probably more like that model, except we're just the size of California. Trying to set the standards like is typical in Europe, that can be really hard. And there's a bit of a movement now in Australia around trying to do that. And then hence the fintech industry, the innovation side of things is saying, oh, this is so frustrating that we've been on this journey for 10 years. We started making some progress, but it's so slow. And now there's revisiting some of the infrastructure questions and some of the policy decisions. That's what comes with trying to say I want a standard. But the flip side of things is you get the standards, you get the whole network effect, you get the ubiquitous experience. I know it's quite simple for me to operate on, because when I send an MPP payment from account to account, I can trust it's almost always going to be exactly the experience I expect to have. Some of the surface layers, we're not there yet with that, and that's got to mature more, and that's where we're getting hung up. But I wouldn't say we're necessarily, doing something different or better than other countries. It's just we're moving along and sort of swinging between different paradigms to get more focused on.
Michael, what do you think, just in terms of, obviously Nium is global, international, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think there's some benefit sometimes to having a prescriptive model. Sometimes it's the point you just made before is that you're amazed at how we all came together to bring the MPP to life, and so many different industry participants with different goals and outcomes, etc. So sometimes it's like herding cats, but having that prescriptive model can sometimes, and when that worked in Europe quite well, to have that. But I also see the flip side of it is when you're taking more of a fragmented approach, and organisations that are taking a risk-based approach into how they'll participate, there's also a lot of benefit there. So, I mean, from our perspective, there'd be some benefit to some further prescription, but look, I think to the point we made before, the system we have in here is probably a good balance between the two, I'd say.
Yeah. I want to turn to, and I think these are amazing thoughts. I just want to turn quickly to the access arrangements in terms of the current access arrangements. Do you think there are things that can be done to make them, are they clear? Are they commercially workable for fintechs and payment innovators in this system? Do you think there are things that can be done better?
Well,
I'm happy for anyone to jump in on that one.
Yeah, sure. I sort of seem to have landed in a bit of a pathway of working with fintechs that have partnered really well with banks. So I've always felt I've suffered, or the businesses I've worked with have suffered less from an access issue, in that we've recognised how we can bring something to market that also offers some benefits to the banks that we work with. And so the banks are willing to support us. Certainly the position that Azupay's in, we're not looking to become we've considered becoming a connected institution on the MPP network, but we're not moving into that for many different reasons. But one of them is that we can develop a commercial model that works for us without going to a connected institution status, as well as having some operational benefits. So the point is, you can build, as a fintech, you can build some commercial proposition that says, actually, I can get a better commercial outcome for my client base by leveraging the infrastructure that's been built by other infrastructure providers, which often might be the banks. And I've now done that through several fintech journeys, that kind of approach. We do struggle a bit what we were talking about before. If you look at the environment of Australia, it's a relatively small economy, and payments, particularly domestic payments where it's relatively low margin, it's all about scale. There's a limit to how far we can go. I think there's limited opportunity for supporting many players getting involved in the fixed capital costs of a good infrastructure layer. So it's going to have a limited number of people or players that are really running the infrastructure in Australia. There's no commercial basis for that many players to be running the infrastructure. So there's going to be some dependency there. And the other lens I think about in Australia is the culture within Australia. I think is very interesting around the risk side of things. So you mentioned having a risk-based decision on where you're going to sit on that. Australia's a culture, we certainly got a belief we're a very safe country. And I think generally it is a very safe country. But something that I've only really been picking up relatively recently, I've been of that perception that other countries tend to have much higher fraud rates than Australia. And I still hear it today, said as a truism amongst the Australian payments industry, that we have a low fraud rate. But actually, many other people say, no, that's not true. In card payment processing, Australia's got one of the highest fraud rates after the US. And that was something that was a bit of an eye-opener to me quite recently. So it is a topic, maybe that's come from the data breaches in previous years. Maybe it's come from our proximity to nations where it's just a good time zone for people working in those nations to be attacking this area. We're relatively wealthy compared to our neighbours. Whatever it is, there are quite high fraud rates. So you can't have a conversation about this right now without talking about that. And that's something the infrastructure players, where they are moving huge numbers of payments very quickly now, it's a real concern for them. So anybody that wants to say, I want more access to the infrastructure, or I want to be an infrastructure participant myself, they have to really come to the table on that space as well, on that topic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point that you've raised, Tom, in relation to the fraud figures relative to Australia, when you talk about the market size in Australia, they are pretty staggering when you look at some of those stats. So it is clearly an issue. It is clearly perhaps where, it's a good point in the conversation to talk about legacy BECS and whether that move away, is that something that should be retained as point of redundancy to some degree? What do you think on that, Michael?
Look, if I could just park the BECS discussion just to chime in on what was just said before, if I may.
Absolutely.
I think from access perspective, and Nium sort of sits there as an end customer of, say, a Paytech or somebody who's giving us access to the MPP. We're not a direct participant ourselves as yet. We have a direct relationship with an ADI for access to the MPP. We have a direct relationship with a Paytech provider to give us access to the MPP. We're actually at the moment working on a secondary ADI relationship. But we're working a lot to have multiple rails of access to the MPP because the access pathway is so narrow. There are only really, if you look at it, and you guys may disagree on this point, 2 ADIs that are really supporting the fintech industry with access. Most of the other ADIs aren't giving fintechs the ability to access, whether it's through a paytech provider. Now, we're establishing multiple connection points to the MPP, not because we're dissatisfied with the service providers we have, but as a way of ensuring continuation of our service. There's one single point of failure in that. If we've got everything banked up with one ADI and they decide to de-risk or make a risk-based approach in terms of, operations we're taking, that could be catastrophic to our business model. So we're investing a lot of time, and this is from Nium's perspective, but I'm sure it's true of many industry participants. We're investing a lot of time in what I would call insurance, and having those direct lines of participation, as opposed to building product and innovating. And there's an opportunity cost that comes with that. So just a little point on there on access. And early this year, our CEO, Prijit Nanu, released that we actually have now started the process of our own restricted ADI journey with APRA. So, and that's been not because we seek anything but bar becoming a direct participant and with the unit economics and everything that comes with it, but it's also around taking our destiny in our own hands. And with that, so that's not a decision we take lightly. It's a very, it's a costly decision, but it's one we need to make because Australia's a priority market for us. So just wanted to round out that point on.
Yeah, and look, and I'd say that they're really good points. And the way I'd like to think about it is I'd love to see that there is enforcement of competition at that level. So there was always in the vision of parts of MPP and particularly of Pay2 of mechanisms that will help with competition, and they have been delayed. And delayed so far, they're off the roadmap now. So that's certainly a problem that I was kind of starting to move towards when you talk about it. There is only space for a relatively limited number of true infrastructure players commercially in Australia. So it's very important that there is the ability to have that competition between them really strongly enforced.
And I do hear what you're saying in that space, Tom. Can I just maybe challenge that a little bit? Because if you have a limited number of infrastructure players and we're moving into payments being really critical national infrastructure, so if we move away and we're very much in a real-time payment settlement situation where we have very minimal infrastructure players, is there not a risk around continuity and potential continuity? So the issues that Michael just talked about in terms of, do we need to diversify a little bit around some of those infrastructures so that we can actually have that level of resilience and continuity moving forward?
Yes, sure. And when I say a limited number, I'm not talking about just two of the big four banks or so on. We are talking, maybe 10 players, something like that. But you look around historically, there have been regimes set up for PSBs to get more involved, get their own exchange settlement account. The adoption of those has been very, very low.
Is that a cost-driven? What do you think is the big issue here? Because that feels cost and legal risk and liability.
Cost is a big part of it. I mean, part of the success we've done is a very resilient network that does work 24/7, 365. The cost of maintaining your system at that level of resilience, with all the indemnities that go to all the other participants in the network when you're directly in the network, there's a huge cost to that. There aren't many players that can support that, and there's certainly very few Australian homegrown businesses when we talk about sovereign risk management. There aren't many of them. And so that's part of it. So certainly it's cost, and certainly at Azupay, to give some context, our clients are the likes of Optus and big brands like that are our clients. So the resilience of our system and the support levels we give are absolutely mission critical. So if we're talking about building anything at the infrastructure level, it's going to be has to be something at the same scale as what the major banks
absolutely
providing already. There's a huge cost to that.
Yeah, and you're operating in that high fraud risk environment because you've got a number of ecosystem players that are in there. So naturally with real-time payment settlements, what do you think, just on that point as well? It's useful maybe to jump in if you're comfortable talking about that in terms of the arrangements around managing real-time payment settlements, the proposals around delayed payments and what that could look like to be able to mitigate those risks, the high fraud environment risks.
Yeah, sure. Well, so when it comes to delayed payments, I mean, that happened. That happened in a somewhat, I'd say, unplanned way, maybe about 2 years ago. Certainly the unplanned nature of that was very damaging actually to the commercial adoption of real-time payments for quite a while. That's now settled down. We can see very clearly in our data that there's more precision being given to that.
Yep.
It's not a sort of a blanket, hey, we just slow down payments. We can see now amongst the major players that there's obviously specific signals about a particular transaction that is causing their systems to say, let's investigate this further. That is much more manageable. However, a key part of the submission we've recently given on the vision of account-to-account payments is the importance that we find a mechanism to let the information flow in real time. So it's very difficult when a bank says, I think there might be an issue here. They can't do tipping off. They can't go and warn somebody. But on the other hand, if we can come up with some mechanism that says, the payment started, because you've got that real-time feedback on an MPP
data.
payment that's really good. To say, look, the payment started, it's not been lost, because that's particularly where we've got problems now. Consumers are being told the payment's done. The receiver of that money says nothing's happened yet. And that causes a lot of anxiety in a real-time payment world. So some kind of messaging at the very least. But at the end of the day, certainly across our client base, we're talking tiny, tiny fractions of 1% of all transactions get affected like this. I'm hearing statistics now, we're starting to work more in partnership with some PSPs in card processing world. And they're talking about, I hadn't realised how many transactions are authorised but don't settle in the next settlement batch on card processing. I had no idea that even happened. The level that's happening that is about the level we're seeing transactions getting affected by holds.
Yep.
But as I've hinted, we've done a lot of work around managing that perception of risk and the partnerships we can with the network.
Fantastic. Michael, did you have any thoughts just around those aspects as well from Nium's perspective in the local market?
You're listening to the FinTech Australia podcast. This season is sponsored by Vanta. Vanta is the leading trust management platform, helping fintech businesses get compliant fast for frameworks like CPS 234, SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more. Vanta's AI and automation power everything, from evidence collection and continuous monitoring to security reviews and vendor risk, whether you're starting up or scaling.
Yeah, look, certainly I think particularly with consumer payments, fraud's always, it's top of mind, and most enforcement actions by regulators are typically around those consumer payments. Nium's been focusing more on B2B, the B2B side of things, although we still do have a lot of clients that are processing P2P payments. But I'd agree with you. I mean, I heard a regulator say recently that they love real-time payments, but they want things to slow down a little bit. So, the world wants to go real-time, but let's just bring it back a little bit. So, it's an interesting point you make. But I think, look, going back to participants and not, I think that's where a lot of value that paytech providers like Azupay bring to the market is the fact that they have got these sophisticated monitoring layers in their tech stack that are able to pick up on certain risky payments and so forth. So as an end user, we rely upon those. We're certainly, a risk to our licenses. Our licenses that we hold globally are paramount to the value that Nium has. So we are certainly always cognizant of managing our risk, in particular around fraud, particularly in a market like Australia. So probably nothing more to add over and above that. But it's certainly something that's top of mind.
Well, look, the other big thing that you would have seen coming out of the budget in terms of the consumer data, right, which is obviously sitting alongside MPP in terms of the B2C, but ATO data is now going to be incorporated and they're doing a pilot test on that, which obviously will help with some of those fraud issues in terms of being able to trend and track and trend activities and trends in relation to fraud. So I think as we become more mature as a country, as a jurisdiction in terms of both the payments provider side as also in terms of the consumers and their use of real-time payments, I think hopefully some of those issues will dissipate. I want to turn very quickly to BECS because I know it's on our itinerary to work through and just maybe talk a little bit around that in terms of, taking account of the opportunities that we see for MPP and clearly Azupay and Nium in this industry moving forward significantly in terms of being able to build traction around some of those opportunities. What's your view, Tom, on BECS? Do you think it should be retained as a redundancy? Do we think we just need to, draw the line and move on?
Look, it's clearly everyone's realised it's not as easy as drawing the line and moving on. To us, I think the most important thing is moving forward on some decisions, and that's everyone's trying to work on that and it's taking its time. What I would like to see really, really soon is a recognition that it's either turn it off and transition and all the pain and cost that goes with that, or it's some significant investment to build it up. people I think are not really talking that clearly, that if it stays, there is quite a lot of investment that must be done. One level, there's, good code goes mouldy. There's a lovely phrase I learned. You have got to keep developing things, and no one's been developing BECS in decades. So that's a problem. But also the world's moved on. So this is my own observation. I've never heard from anywhere else, but I don't know how many people realise that when the travel rule was introduced across Australia, BECS was exempted from that. I've always assumed that exemption was on the basis that the powers that be were told BECS is going to be turned off in 2030. So if it's not being turned off, presumably we've got to add in all that extra data into the BECS fields pretty soon. I don't think the powers that be overseas are going to accept BECS carrying on without that, let alone ISO compatibility and so on. So there's a huge cost to be borne to keep BECS going. And I would like that, even if we can't decide which of those paths we're going down, I would like to see more public acknowledgement of that. Because what's going to happen, I firmly believe, is either going to be BECS starts becoming more expensive to run and therefore more expensive for users to actually use at the end, or it gets shut down. Either way, there's the massive benefits available to commercial businesses now to switch across to MPP. There's huge benefits for them. And the reason they don't is BECS is virtually free, but it's not always going to be like that. It cannot always be like that.
So you feel pricing should be something that influences behaviour.
Look,
price
it
it out
certainly
and
is.
the people will...
Yes.
Yeah, that's an
Look,
interesting
pricing
point.
already is influencing it, but people aren't being realistic about what it takes to keep BECS going.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's a really good point, and I think, it's like anything, right? Because you're moving away from bank to bank and interbank to a larger ecosystem, and there's clearly benefits for doing that. But if the intention is to sort of, as you say, to transition away from BECS, what are the conditions that we think need to happen apart from the cost, right? There's got to be investment. I think that's an acknowledgement in terms of maintaining so the technology is not obsolete and other things. But what are the conditions from an infrastructure perspective or from an environment perspective do you think needs to happen in order for us to maintain that for a period and then it runs alongside until NPP and other related payment rails become a little bit more mature in this marketplace and more widely adopted?
Yeah, clearly one of the big topics that people are drilling into is the size of some batch payments on BECS. So, within the NPP teams, they're looking at potentially batching type settlement arrangements on NPP, or it could be that we keep BECS going for that reason. That's certainly one key piece. My understanding, I'm not too involved in these conversations, is the ability for government to change, particularly federal government. That's very challenging. It's a big exercise for them to change, which was why a date was set, I think, because they say, hey, some organisations have multi-year timeframes, and that's just dragged on and on. So got to have a movement there. The other one that's interesting is resilience. So in my job, small company, even though I'm Chief Product Officer, I do get the notifications when there's any kind of issue on the MPP from any participant kind of thing. And or actually that includes on BECS. So you see all the time, like several times a day, that some BECS participant is having some issue with some element of reporting. No one ever notices because BECS isn't instant settlement. Whereas if you're out for even just half an hour on the MPP
the outages
aspect,
and migration
you
phase.
really notice it. However, that's not... It certainly Azupay is solving that. So our clients have no visibility or no awareness on many of these outages because we can store and forward and manage that for their experiences. Obviously, some really super high velocity use cases, they might notice like, it seemed to have gone slow for a period of time, but nothing really drastic. So there does need to be that ability for the different commercial use cases to understand if I'm on NPP, what's the implication of a participant being down on one of the services for some short period of time. And that's going on with BECS all the time, but you don't notice it because as long as it hits the next 2 hour window or even the next day, you don't notice any difference to your business processes.
Michael?
Yeah, look, we're taking a bit more of an agnostic perspective on it. We use both rails. BECS does a lot of the heavy lifting that the MPP doesn't for certain use cases, as you rightly noted. I think the conditions need to be right to sunset it, so I would echo everything that's been said already. From our perspective, it's a good point you make around redundancy, and that it's that sort of that safety net that everyone's relying upon at the moment is that BECS will be there in case there's an MPP outage or something around that. So. What we see, though, at a practical user level with our customers is that, particularly in the B2B space, is that they're forced to use BECS, that certain banks aren't supporting MPP settlements, etc., for B2B payments. So we'd want to see the conditions right in order to move that away as somebody that'd be overly impacted. So that's probably...
Well, I think for you particularly, you're dealing with a lot of international or plays with international flows. And a lot of banks haven't connected into the IPS service on MPP yet.
That's right. And even just domestically, though, we've got clients that are willing to settle with us at the moment, and B2B flows aren't supported. They're being processed via DE and BECS.
So that integration with domestic infrastructure in order for you to be able to scale more broadly, not just from a global perspective, but also having that
just looking
integration.
at domestic use. Certain banks that we've got, I won't name them here, but that we've got customers that are banking with them seeking to give us some funding. And we've got a great offshore, cross-border real-time payments service that we're offering them, but their settlement to us in Aussie dollars is taking, it's intraday, or it's, they rely on batch payments. So we'd want to see that, particularly for B2B use cases, be more of a level playing field, more access there. And then we can talk about the IPS portion and that interoperability with other payment systems.
I think that point on interoperability and I guess from Nium's perspective, looking ahead, how do we look at cross-border in terms of where we get to with Australia on A2A? How do we deal with some of those issues? Because we see some of those issues coming up in SWIFT, for example, even now in SWIFT payments. How do we deal with some of the interoperability issues? Like if we're getting the domestic infrastructure, we've got to get that right. But then how do we deal with that from a global perspective?
It's a good point. So I'll talk to it from a Nium perspective. That's the value that we offer. We're direct participants in so many of these local clearing systems and payment systems. A lot of customers use us because they don't want to rely upon SWIFT. So we're connecting those dots. However, we see that there's certainly, when looking at it from an interoperability perspective, we've seen what some of these bilateral arrangements will do, particularly to consumer payments. We've seen in Singapore the tie-up with the UPI, Pay Now and UPI. That bilateral arrangement has certainly improved and given greater access to P2P payments for those two corridors. We've seen it with the Pay Now and Prompt Pay in Thailand, for example. But those bilateral type of arrangements are very costly to be done. They need to be driven by governments and central banks, etc. So we're a ways off seeing that scale in my mind. But certainly there's moves afoot, I believe, and I need to quote my notes here, but Project Nexus, there's a move to get a framework of multilateral kind of arrangements between different payment systems and clearing systems being done. I know that the Reserve Bank made some comments around that last year, around just observing it, seeing where we're up to, but we're a ways off being able to sort of, I think Australia being a direct participant in some of those multilateral kinds of arrangements. And I think that's where Nium plays, is that we've got a global strategy to be those direct participants in local clearing, getting access to local payouts, and we bridge that. And that's really what a lot of our business model is based on.
Yeah, definitely. Tom, did you want to talk to that in terms of just more broadly, I guess, in terms of Project Nexus and also the RBA's recent views on some of the interoperability issues for cross-border payments? Is that something Azupay, I appreciate you're very much domestic in terms of your your infrastructure, but in relation to some of your customers and how they engage?
Yeah, look, so yes, Azupay is very much domestically focused. I have had years of cross-border payments experience, so I sort of know the problem they're talking about, but it isn't something we're coming across. What's interesting is we do partner, for example, with many of the international banks, so they're good examples of their whole remit on a transactional banking services often is dealing with the large global corporates from their home country, and they provide the Australian dollar banking for them in this country. So they're certainly very focused on they're looking for standardization. So it's not necessarily connecting the domestic payment systems of Australia to the domestic systems overseas. They're saying if the experience can be simple for them to support their clients in the same way in every country, that would be great. Australia's got a long history of doing things differently in payments, sometimes very successfully and perhaps trailblazed a bit for the rest of the world. But it can be very hard. So certainly many of these international banks, and where more nimble players like Nium have a great opportunity. It's these international banks say, at the end of the day, I'm struggling to get my business case across the line to actually build something specifically to the great things that MPP builds, because it's different from in Australia than the rest of the world. But if you build something that's great, that is at least similar enough to how great things might run in other countries, then some of these international players can more easily connect directly into our systems here. So it's very much that standardization rather than necessarily the infrastructure or the scheme operators worrying about how to connect to other scheme operators.
Yeah, and standardization is difficult in the best of times
is.
and challenging,
It is.
whether
That's
it's
right.
technical
I don't think
standardization
any
or
of these
otherwise.
cross-border payment players are going to go out of business anytime soon. There's plenty of opportunity to solve, for sure.
Absolutely. What do we think? I mean, we've talked a little bit around BECS. We've talked a little bit around, the global piece. But in terms of domestically and, the concerns, I guess, or some of the challenges around adoption of the new payment platform and different types of rails, what do we think needs to happen for it to be more compelling in this jurisdiction? And I mean, we've talked a little bit around cost, for example. Are there other conditions that we think need to happen, need to shift, need to change? Is that something where we need more buy-in from the banks in terms of engagement? Or what do we see as some of the conditions?
I think it's getting clear on what's the pathway at a really, at a national infrastructure level. I think we've lost some direction there, and certainly a lot of big players and payroll companies, superannuation companies, large utilities. Roll back 2-3 years ago, they're all very excited about Pay2. That didn't quite happen. Roll back a couple of years before that, they're very excited about open banking. That didn't quite happen. They're all looking, Payday Super is going to change everything, but now we're very, very close and it's clearly not changing a lot. And so I think there's so much that's sitting on the hands. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of people saying, I think this will be really good. But I'm struggling to be clear on landing my business case. What is a really interesting observation, I've actually just had feedback from a Women in Payments event that's going on at lunchtime today. There's a lot of feedback on confirmation of Payee. So that's just rolled out. And we were talking about before that you can't get away from talking around the risk and fraud side of things. And the payments industry has really picked up on confirmation of Payee as being a really great tool. So there's so much talk now, and it's so valid, and it's going to really accelerate, is saying I can now connect things like confirmation of Payee, the extra information and insights I can get from the use of a Pay ID, connect that around with recognizing and all your sort of the network data around how trustworthy a particular transaction can be. I think that's a piece that we're starting to see organically is suddenly really moving. Confirmation of Payee has really changed the landscape a lot in Australian domestic account-to-account payments.
Yeah, I agree.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, just double-clicking on something you said earlier. When we've got great initiatives like, Pay2 and Pay ID, I've not seen a lot of just at a consumer, whilst consumer adoption is a lot more mature than, say, B2B adoption of such, there's not a lot of consumer education. If we just flip this on its head and look at it, just everyday consumers, there's not a lot of education by the banks, by the large participants on how to use it, how to access it, what the benefits are, particularly for certain use cases in e-com and other things as well. So it's sort of like participants like Azupay and others that are heralding the advantages of these things as opposed to the banks themselves. And that's just my view, not Nium's view per se, but I've always wondered the absence of bulk consumer education on these kinds of things. It seems to be not as well as it could have been done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's something, I do quite a bit around the CDR, and it's something we see and hear all the time in terms of, what is the education? Do we need to have the education for consumers more directly? And so, but sometimes you look at that and go, should consumers even know what CDR is? Ultimately the outcome for them is the payments actually happened. Yeah. And we don't really care realistically how it happened. I just want to click on my app and I want to make sure that I get payments from A to B, and that's how it goes. So it's almost like, that all needs to happen in the background without, to some degree, a level of transparency or education. But I hear what you're saying, because it is about take-up. And I think the big issue that you're picking up there is the adoption piece and the take-up piece. Do you think the current, and I ask this for both of you, just in the context of the regulatory, and as a lawyer, I'm going to ask these obvious questions, because I think, we look at it and we see cost, we see from an industry perspective, we see cost, we see some of the challenges around take-up, we see some of the standardization points that you've talked about. Do you think regulation, because we are moving into, and it is becoming, particularly with the new reforms on payment systems, heavily regulated? Are you supportive of that level of regulation? Are you concerned about that level of regulation? Do you think it's going down the right path? Tom, you're smiling. I love it.
Well, we certainly have a lot of regulation. And I say for the last few years, I've been very myopically focused in Australia, but I just feel like I've heard a few comments from, I'm trying to think, I don't want to name names, but maybe policy people at Stripe or Wise, and they make jokes about just the sheer volume of legislation paper in Australia versus other countries they operate in. So clearly that's not ideal. Clearly we're not quite heading the right direction for that reason. I couldn't sit here and think, how do we stop that? How do we change that? I certainly wouldn't want to embark on some whole of government, whole of industry initiative just to reduce legislation. I'd rather we just focus on other things and get moving with some innovation. But perhaps that does talk to a bit of what I was talking before, that an industry level participants have perhaps lost a bit of their way on thinking around how do we really help, you know, the end user, the businesses, the economy overall just get more productive from better payments.
Or is it, and I mean, this is maybe the question and the point that you were making earlier, Michael, in terms of looking at risk. And should we look at risk rather than let's regulate everything? Do we need to look at risk? Do we need to look at where the high risks are, where the less risks are, where there's areas where we can look at a lighter touch in terms of regulation?
Yeah, look, I would agree. If there's a risk-based approach, that's certainly, I think is probably a good thing. But just on the change in regulation, I mean, again, probably best I don't, comment. We do see the sheer number of regulators in Australia, something as a global player. I mean, we're regulated by 3 parties here now, so it's there's a lot of complexity there.
Yes.
I would agree. But for us, and particularly the regulatory changes you're talking about, it's the length of time they're taking to implement. So that presents a lot of uncertainty. I can speak to our journey around, do we our own restricted ADI journey we're taking. Did we hold off and wait for the new regulation to come up? We don't know what the outcome of that will be. So I think the time it's taking to embed this is potentially leading to a lack of investment or a lack of delayed investment in certain innovation. And that's something that I think if a decision's made, I'm not going to comment on the pros and cons of the legislation. I'm in sales after all, it's not my job. But what I can say, though, is that the time to take to implement produces a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty is something, you've mentioned it before, is something this industry doesn't need. We need to know where we're going and how quickly it's going to take us to get there. So
yeah, and certainly just setting up all this uncertainty about where things are going, it's just entrenching incumbents, it's entrenching the legacy technology. You talked about what's been slow on adoption. I mean, it is really interesting. Consumer adoption of real-time account-to-account payments is very high in Australia. It just got turned on for them. Do they have to be educated? Maybe not, but I've got the old cliche of kids going to that stage where they're becoming financially independent, and they're all kind of like shocked. It's like, what do you mean the payment didn't land immediately? And
absolutely. I have the same frustration. If I'm sending payments and it doesn't happen, I get very frustrated about that. In fact, 8 years ago when I came to Australia first, the whole interoperability with banking and not being able to change banks was a massive issue for me. So I do get it. I completely get it. And I agree with you. I think consumers, as in the more educated consumers, want real-time payments. They want it to happen automatically. So is it incumbent on the industry? And when I say industry, I mean all players in the industry, including banks and the government and infrastructure providers and payments providers, to facilitate that and to drive that so there's less customer friction around how payments are actually made and how they're actually done. Is that really where the future, when we think about this podcast and the future of account-to-account payments, where do we see that? Is that where we think we need to focus from an infrastructure perspective? So rather than less on the consumer and the education piece, but actually more on how do we get this done?
Look, I totally agree with that. And it's particularly getting the businesses to be able to really effectively and quickly adopt it and use it. So it's not necessarily sort of the infrastructure level, it's that level above it, it's the platforms. So it's only a lot of e-commerce platforms, the card schemes have done a fantastic job of getting themselves really entrenched. And it's becoming hard to switch the behaviours at that level. So you have plenty of enterprises right now, especially with potentially them not being able to send out, or definitely not being able to send out the pricing signals pretty soon around how they steer their customers to a lower cost payment method. They're very interested to say, well, how do I start encouraging my users to use account-to-account payments in an e-commerce context when I can't surcharge my card payment? And lots of conversations on that. It's quite a big piece of work for many of them to then say, well, I've got my commerce player, I've got my global fintech that's running my payment processing. How do I work with them to help steer things? Those platform players sitting there saying, well, actually, I've got a pretty good embedded payments margin line here that the whole industry's been really promoting for many years. That's very entrenched. So it's actually probably, and that talks to that competition layer. How do we make sure it's not just talking about the big banks? How do we get them to open up to a more competitive playing field, but also the platform layer above them that actually really gets those businesses going. Another little anecdote is a lot of big enterprises very interested in the capabilities around Payee, and we've got some great clients doing some really great stuff with that. A lot of them are struggling to get up and going because putting the ability to use a Payee in their SAP instance is incredibly hard. So it's actually the ERPs, getting the ERPs up to speed with this stuff. So look, the businesses want it. The banking infrastructure's actually got some really good stuff we can run with. It's getting those platforms moving. And so a bit of focus on industry level around how do we help make it more attractive for businesses to do that. That's how you get the kind of adoption you're talking about there, which is where as a consumer, when I'm interacting with my business or my government, I want to use these better payment methods. That's a challenge there. Lots
of work for FinTech Australia then, I can see, in this industry forum. So plenty of opportunity there. Michael, did you have any final thoughts in that aspect?
No, I think it's been articulated well. I think, too often we think about ourselves as the participants or as a player in the value chain of these payments, but there's probably not a lot of thought from a lot of players on the end customer and what's best for them. And I with my commercial hat on, I'm always thinking about what's best for the customer and that driving adoption and demand, etc. But yeah, it's exciting times ahead, no doubt.
It's exciting times. I mean, if I was to leave our podcast, because I think we're almost at time, and I really want to thank both of you for your contributions. They're fantastic, and it's great to hear from really knowledgeable industry experts in this space. But if I can leave you with maybe one, or if you can leave our listeners rather with one last thought around account to account and the future of account to account in Australia. Tom, any final thoughts? Where do you think we're going to be if we look at, what are we now, 2026? Give us 10 years, 2036. Any predictions as to where we think we might be in this space?
Yeah, look, I think account-to-account payments in Australia, it is going to get adopted for a lot more use cases. So the infrastructure and the vision has done a great job of building something that's really powerful. But in terms of making it work for individual use cases, all the detail wasn't worked through, and that's a bit of a journey, but that is going to land. And we're going to see a lot more usage of it, a lot more use cases. People aren't even thinking about it right now.
Fantastic. So really, we need to have it landing, all these kind of amazing benefits from NPP that we do see, real-time payments, lower cost, better data. We got to land them across use cases, real-time use cases. Michael?
Yeah, look, I just like to see, the NPP's, functionality being used to its fullest. It should be absolutely be used for all use cases in Australia, I would hope, in 10 years. But we had that BECS conversation earlier. I think that really brings to the power of what's capable within this environment. And so, and from our perspective, it just complements what we're doing. We're real-time players. We want real-time payments into Australia, and we're now doing that. Real-time payments out and potentially seeing some interoperability with other payment systems. But yeah, I think it's a bright future ahead.
Brilliant. And pushing towards more cross-border interoperability from Nium's perspective.
Absolutely.
Well, look, I want to say, I think we are at time, but thank you both very, very much. Really appreciate it. Love the conversation. Great to talk to you both. And I think we'll leave it here. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in for this episode of the FinTech Australia podcast. This season is sponsored by Vanta. Compliance regulations, third-party risk, and customer security demands are all growing and changing fast. Is your manual audit and compliance program actually slowing you down? If you're thinking there must be something more efficient than spreadsheets, screenshots, and all manual processes, you're right. Audits and compliance can be so much easier, while strengthening your security posture and actually driving revenue for your business. Vanta's trust management platform automates key areas of your certification program, including compliance, internal and third-party risk, and customer trust, and streamlines the way you gather and manage information. And the impact is real. The recent IDC analysis found that compliance teams using Vanta are 129% more productive. So you get more time and energy to focus on strengthening your security posture and protecting your business. Vanta. continuous compliance, how much easier trust can be. Go to vanta.com/FinTech Australia podcast to get started.